We've come to the end of The Undiscovered Self, a short book by Carl Jung that if you haven't read it by now, I recommend that you run out and get it now. And the conclusion gives us quite a bit to mull over, and it's not completely self-evident at times what Jung is talking about, so I'm glad that I'm spending a little bit more time just on this one chapter. He says at the beginning of it, what our age thinks of the shadow, an inferior part of the psyche, contains more than something merely negative. The very fact that through self-knowledge, that is, by exploring our own souls, we come upon the instincts and their world of imagery, should throw some light on the powers slumbering in the psyche, of which we are seldom aware so long as all goes well. It depends entirely on the preparedness and attitude of the conscious mind whether the eruption of these forces and the images and ideas associated with them will tend towards construction or catastrophe. These sentences sum up the core of Carl Jung's arguments so far. We have this shadow, this part of our psyche that is very powerful. It contains the power to either construct or to destruct. He equates to a certain extent in this brief sentence the instincts with the shadow, but I think what he's trying to get at isn't really about details or about making fine distinctions, but basically saying that there's these forces, unconscious forces within us that are very powerful and strong, and they can spur human beings on to great endeavors and great accomplishments, either for individuals or even for society, or they can become very destructive if they are not handled well. And he says it depends entirely on whether the conscious mind is prepared and what attitude the conscious mind has as to whether these forces will be expressed in images and ideas that are constructive or whether they will be expressed in images and ideas that are destructive. Then follows a little bit of discussion of the role of psychiatry. And, I have a question there. Did Jung put too much hope in the power of the profession of psychiatry? Yes, I suppose my opinion is yes. If by psychiatry we mean, again, psychiatry in the narrow sense, or maybe even just Jung's particular approach to psychiatry. Every great thinker thinks that, or at least they hope, that their ideas will have a huge impact. But as we know, as time went by, the Jungian perspective on psychology was not the most prominent. In fact, the Freudian one continued to be more powerful than his, and then pretty soon they were both eclipsed by a different type of psychiatry that Jung would no doubt think was part of the problem, which is more or less the idea that that our psychological state is mainly caused by external circumstances and chemical processes, and is treatable by behavior modification and drugs. I think Jung would have probably thought that this was to be lumped in with the harmful impact of the growth of the state, of technocracy, of the technological mentality, of the scientific rationalist mentality, and all of that. So anyway, I mean, if he thought that his particular brand of psychiatry or psychological theory would be a great healing force, it wasn't, or at least not for quite some time. I think what's interesting is right now we're seeing it have more impact on the popular mind than it's had in a long time. And that's really interesting and something to kind of contemplate on, whether it's the thought of or the lectures of Jordan Peterson. And I know he's a controversial figure and I don't really like bringing him up, but that's he's an elephant in the room, right? And so he's popular. Right now, getting people to listen to things that they probably would have never listened to before, read before, etc. And you see the Jungian way of looking at things coming through in other areas of our culture, including in certain expressions of religion. So that's interesting. So yes, he put too much hope, at least in the short run, and probably even in the long run, on his particular profession. But that's not to say that it doesn't contribute and lend itself to people being able to think out solutions. His voice of criticism about the deadening, leveling effect of mechanization and technocratic thinking, he is joined by many other voices that come from different perspectives outside of psychology. And I've covered some of them in this channel, including Jacques Ellul and Hans Morgenthau, and there's a ton more who come from the 20th century and in the wake of the world wars began to question whether humanity really was on this onwards and upwards path to, technological, political perfection. So anyway, he says here, it lies within our reach to help individuals gain greater knowledge of themselves, and then they can influence those around them. And I think this is what he thinks psychiatry is best able to do, not just on the couch in the office, although that is a big part of it for him, but also in the types of things he's doing by writing this book. And he says those individuals who can gain greater knowledge of themselves, of that inner self, they become or can become then influential to others, and through this sort of ripple effect can influence the people around them. He calls these mana personalities. They're people who unconsciously exude a sort of inspirational force on others. I have Mother Teresa in the background there because Mother Teresa was a problematic figure for a lot of Christians, because apparently after she died, we learned through her own writing that she had profound doubts, crises of faith almost constantly throughout her entire career, and yet she did sacrifice so much, and she was a iconic figure, even well beyond Christianity, of what it means to just give of oneself and to empty oneself and in the pursuit of loving and helping other people. So she's a modern day saint figure of sorts, and certainly I think Jung would identify her as a mana personality, because she exuded this force of goodness, this sort of influence of goodness, simply by her face, but I mean her actions, the things that she did, the things that she said. But you got the sense that there was not a calculation there. After talking about the way individuals can transform, he spends a little bit of time on the cultural signs of change. He says we're living during a time in which the zeitgeist is changing. That is the spirit of the times. He says the unconscious zeitgeist compensates the attitude of the conscious mind and anticipates changes to come. And you can see this through various signs in the culture that emerge without conscious calculation. And the example that he gives of this, which is a very good one, because art has always been that by which you can see like the content, the sort of intellectual but spiritual content of a civilization. And he points to modern art. Again, he's living at a time when modern art is on the rise, and where older art forms are diminishing or not being taken as seriously. And a lot of people were upset by this in the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century. Many people thought, oh my God, it's not even art. I have a Picasso there. Well, you can't call that woman traditionally pretty now, can you? But modern art isn't about, it seems, creating something beautiful in the traditional sense, meaning, symmetrical, pleasant, and calming to behold. Rather, you look at it and it provokes all sorts of rather unpleasant feelings. When I look at it, I see anxiety and shattering, brokenness. He says that modern art is breaking down and destroying previous aesthetic views of what is beautiful in form and meaningful in content. So it's serving this function, which people at the time that it came out, or when it really started to gain force, the people who didn't like it, who weren't into expressing themselves in any new way, did not appreciate, certainly did not, reacted negatively to its attempt to change or develop meaning outside of the normal cultural frame. But Jung's point was that this modern art was now reflecting on our increasing rejection of objective forms towards subjective chaos. It was more or less recording the transition out of many of our old traditional forms, symbols, ways of expressing ourselves. So think about all the old paintings all the way up and through the 19th century that were of an iconic nature in the religious sense of showing traditional biblical scenes, or new scenes, but scenes that depicted recognizable states of the soul and states of the mind. But then it starts to change in the 19th century. You start to get some brewing of really different and dark imagery. And then in the 20th century, you get things like this. I'm not an expert on art at all, so don't rely on me for much knowledge there, but I do get Jung's point about modern art expressing the zeitgeist, and how perhaps that it shows how unconsciously the human mind is breaking down. But the interesting thing is it's breaking down the old symbols and mythologies supposedly in order to build something else up in their place. So it's not some sort of aesthetic catastrophe, it's a transition. He calls this transition period the metamorphosis of the gods. It's when you go from one view of the gods, so to speak, these great unconscious forces and how they are expressed in symbols, the archetypes, and how they're expressed in symbols and ceremonies and rituals and imagery. And we are going into another, which reminded me of the caterpillar, the cocoon, the butterfly, that beautiful image of one thing which isn't too bad. The caterpillar, typically a rather adorable creature, then constructs this tomb, or supposedly looks like a ugly thing that it crawls inside, spins around itself, and appears to be dead, and then out of that comes something even more beautiful. He says we are living in a time of world destruction and world renewal, and he's not just referring to the world wars, although they're in the mix, but it's the destruction of a mental world. Human beings' concepts have grown beyond the old symbolism, the science, the technology, the managerial skills that human beings have developed are potent conscious forces that have challenged and are beginning to defeat the old-fashioned religious mythological views. And so it's almost as though Jung is saying it's time to go into the cocoon, or this is the cocoon of darkness that is symbolized by modern art and by the cultural confusion more generally in the Western world in the 20th and now the 21st century. So to make it clear, he says, as at the beginning of the Christian era, So again today, we are faced with the problem of the moral backwardness which has failed to keep pace with our scientific, technical, and social developments. Think about the technical capacity of ancient Rome. They built things that rival some of the greatest architectural achievements of our own time. They understood very well aesthetics, and they created many beautiful things. They created incredible political institutions that survived as ideas up and through into our world today. They created an empire that once held sway all over Europe. And yet they were the same people who did these types of things, sending Christians to the lions in the arena and crucifying people. Their technology had outstripped their moral compass. Their capabilities were running way ahead of their humanity. And he's saying here this is the same situation we find ourselves in again, as if we are a modern Rome. We are Rome again, on the cusp of another disintegration. Christianity came as Rome was on the cusp of disintegration because it developed or emerged as a sort of contradiction to the empire and its values, and it presented a revolutionary new idea of who reigned and how to live. In other words, who reigned? Well, from the Romans' perspective, either the people or the emperor, or both, reigned, depending on the time. And as far as how to live, well, for the Romans, that was, to live as well materially as possible, and to hedge one's bets with sacrifice, and definitely hope that you continued to enjoy the fruits and benefits and spoils of the empire. And then the Christians come along and implicitly and explicitly basically say, no, this Jesus is now king, and not the emperor, not the people, not the government of Rome. And as far as how to live, they seem to extol a way of life that was in direct opposition to what was popularly valued. It would seem that this is what Jung thinks is needed now. I would gather it would look very different than it did then, but here we have the emergence of another type of empire, or maybe an extension and magnification of empire. It's an empire that can extend into the minds, the habits, the daily activities of people, their spiritual life. It's a much more extensive empire, right? Modern government, economy, whether it's communist, socialist, capitalist, at this point, the same impacts can happen. As we've noted earlier in this book, he's basically said communism and capitalism have quite a bit in common as far as how they deal with the human being and what values they extol. So I think Jung is saying there needs to be a revival of sorts, a sort of renewal that provides the, quote, life-preserving myth of the inner man. Because remember, he's basically said without this myth, and remember, myth doesn't mean it's a lie. It means it's a story that people can tell about themselves and believe about themselves, that tells them who they are. And he said that people have to be aware of and foster the inner man if they aren't going to succumb to the powers of the world, if they're not going to be rolled over by some form of totalitarianism, some form of authoritarianism, and conformism. So I think Jung would very much like this particular passage from Ephesians. which is our wrestling. Our wrestling is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the world of this darkness, against the spirits of wickedness in the high places. Again, Rome built things that last even until this day. I found this picture of an old Roman building. Look at the workmanship there. Look at the achievements that these people managed with far less equipment, far less machinery than we have today. But they were not good, or they were not all good. And the more powerful they got, the less heed they paid to goodness. And so here came this religion whose main message seemed to be to push back, to reject worldly values and this kind of pomp and political power. So Jung returns to this theme of the individual and the need for the individual to somehow remain intact, and the role of religion in either aiding that or impeding it. He calls for a revisioning of Christianity, and he's already done this a lot in this book, but he's criticized as not very useful at this point in time. A religion that is authoritarian or top-down, that's highly structured, that mainly involves the embracing of a creed, which one adheres to wholeheartedly and cannot contradict or question, as well as the contract thinking that tends to be emphasized oftentimes by Christianity. That is the idea that more or less Christ came to get people out of jail free, and so if we believe, then we will obtain heaven, and that's the main idea of the whole religion. I have a picture up here which I'm sure is going to be challenging to a lot of people. It even is to me, I suppose. If you happen to be a Christian and you take Christianity seriously, seeing people recreate the Last Supper is always a little problematic. But the reason I put it up there, this is Kendrick Lamar in Humble. A lot of Christian themes run throughout Lamar's work, and he's obviously struggles as an individual with it in some of the imagery and some of the words in his music. There's criticism in some of the imagery and words. There's just an embeddedness in it, and then sometimes you see a positivity about it, but it's a very much a part of who he is and what he does. And we see this in a lot of music, these sort of implicit or explicit religious themes. And in the past, we have had major cultural meltdowns about things like this. Back in the 80s and even into the 90s, if an artist did something like this, and they did, it would make the cover of Time magazine, and there would be this huge, cultural outcry and battle over what to think about it and maybe even what to do about it. But no matter which side might have the correct stance on things like this, back then or now, they represent a culture that is struggling mightily with spirituality and is breaking the lines, so to speak, crossing the line seriously, and is not willing to let the imagery and the ideas go, but through playing with them and questioning them, is attempting some transformation of them, or so one might think if one looked at this type of thing through the Jungian lens. Here we see an individual expressing himself about ideas and forms that are very, very old and are moving through him and becoming something new. These are more cultural signs. There's some parallel between this and the Picasso. So anyway, some food for thought. Jung ends the chapter and the book saying, "I'm neither spurred on by excessive optimism nor in love with high ideals, but I'm merely concerned with the fate of the individual human being, that infinitesimal unit on whom a whole world depends, and in whom, if we read the meaning of the Christian message aright, even God seeks his goal." All right, I'll see you next week.